All right, welcome to the last video in our plant module, so module 13. So far we've discussed the evolution of plants, kind of an introduction of plants, how we divide them, what their characteristics are, and the important factors that um, they had to deal with whenever they made the transition from a permanent aquatic lifestyle to a more terrestrial based lifestyle. And then after that, in our second video, we took a look at the seedless plants that were the first two groups to evolve of the plant groups that we will be talking about. So the bryophytes, which are the seedless non-vascular plants, and then the um, lycophytes and ferns, the pteridiophytes, which are the vascular non-seed plants or the vascular seedless plants. And so what this video is going to focus on is the final two groups of plants, which are vascular plants that do have seeds. So we now are getting into plant groups that have those vascular structures. So the xylem, the phloem that's carrying the water and the nutrients throughout the plant body, and then also producing seeds. So now the production of seeds is really important because it makes the plant, or it allows the plant to have reproduction that is independent of needing water. So it's independent from water. So they don't have to live in these moist environments in order for the gametes to swim to each other and for fertilization to happen. Now, also in the earlier plant forms, if you remember, the gametophyte were dominant, so they had this diplontic lifestyle. Whereas when we get to ferns, the sporophyte becomes dominant, and we now start seeing, I'm sorry, the bryophytes are haplontic. So the gametophyte is haploid, so they have a haplontic lifestyle. And so the ferns and now the gymnosperms and angiosperms, which we will start discussing in this video, are all sporophyte dominant, meaning that their diploid life cycle is the more dominant life stage of their life cycle. So they are diplontic. And so the two groups that we're going to look at today, or in this video, the gymnosperms and angiosperms, all are sporophyte dominant. And they all are heterosporous. So if you remember from the first video, I believe it was, we discussed how the gametes can either be the same type, same size, or they could be two different types and two different sizes, meaning that, for example, you can have microspores and megaspores. So microspores would be the pollen, the megaspores would be the eggs, and that's the case that we see in gymnosperms and angiosperms, is that all of these species are going to be heterosporous, so they're going to have two different types of gametes. Now, with the conifers, the angiosperms, and even say the ferns, the gametes are not free living like they were in the bryophyte groups. So if you remember, the moss had the sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte. And so the gametophyte was free living and the sporophyte was dependent on the gametophyte. Now that's not the case, as we'll see in the conifers and the angiosperms. The gametophytes are now going to grow on the sporophytes. So for example, your pollen cones and the cones that contain the eggs on conifers grow directly on the tree, and they depend on the sporophyte for nutrients. And so the tree is the sporophyte of the individual. And so now the gametophytes in these higher groupings are not free living, and they actually develop inside spores. And the seeds and the pollen, again, is really what's driving the independence from water. So now you have this protective seed coat that does not allow for the embryo inside to dry out, and makes that water not necessary. Pollen can also be dispersed much more easily over time and distance. It doesn't need water to be dispersed. Pollen can be dispersed through water flows, but it also can be dispersed through wind, it's through other organisms or animals. And so now we have this dispersal ability for the gametes that is, again, not driven by the need to swim in water. And so the development of pollen and seeds is really important for the success of terrestrial plants to really take off. All right, so for seeded plants, and here we're going to look at an example of the gymnosperm. So their life cycles for seeded plants basically revolves around the male pollen pollinating and fertilizing a female ovule. And the male pollen has two cells that are inside of the structure. One divides into two sperm, and the other will form a pollen tube that basically grows down into the to meet the ovule, so that the sperm can then fertilize the egg. And so the female has two ovules, but only one surviving cell will enclose the egg. And we'll look at a figure of that in the next slide. And so the seed will actually contain 3 generations of tissues. Okay. And so those 3 generations are basically the seed coat for protection. And that seed coat is made from the parent plant. Okay. The gametophyte is the current generation, and that provides the nutrients. And then inside of that, you have the embryo, which is tissue from the future generation. So what the embryo will develop into the future plant. So you actually have 3 generations of tissues: the parent plant, the current generation, and then the future generation, which is pretty interesting. So here we have a typical sporophyte, a conifer tree. That tree will have female cones or male cones, and the female cone will grow in the upper branches, where it will be fertilized by the pollen cones that typically grow on the lower branches, and that pollen will land on the cone, and then inside the cone there are these scales. They're really thin scales, almost paper-like, and at the end of the scale is where the ovule is. That's where the ovule is located. And so the pollen grain will land, and then one of those cells, remember, will grow as a pollen tube, and the other develops into 2 sperm. They will travel through that pollen tube, and then fertilization will occur in the megaspore, which is inside the ovule. And that will lead to that zygote and the embryo forming inside the seed. And then once the seeds are developed, they will disperse and then germinate into mature trees. And so this is just a generalization of your typical conifer tree, which again comes from the gymnosperms. Okay. And so we talked about what is really unique for the 2 groupings that we're going to discuss next. So that's the presence of seeds. And so you only see seeds existing in gymnosperms and angiosperms. And now gymnosperms are basically just your conifer trees. So like your pine trees, sequoia trees, your redwoods, spruce trees, cedars, etc. And they have really characteristic traits. Not really characteristic, but some of the more common characteristics, there you go, that you would see on conifer trees is the needle-like structures, cones. They typically grow fairly tall with spire-like tops or pointier tops because they're adapted to cold areas. They also do really well in drier areas, and they typically keep their leaves year round, so they're referred to as evergreen. However, some of those species are deciduous. There are some deciduous conifer species. These are what we refer to as more primitive than angiosperms, and primitive doesn't mean it's at a lower standard. It just basically means that they evolved first. And so they're more primitive than angiosperms, meaning that they evolved before angiosperms evolved. And their wood, the trunk, basically has no vessel elements. And these vessel elements, and so this doesn't mean vascular elements, so they do have xylem and phloem, but their wood is softer because they don't have vessel elements, whereas um, trees like deciduous trees, such as um, oak trees, um, maple, etc., they contain vessel elements, and so they have what's known as a hardwood. And so conifers have that soft wood, whereas hardwoods, like your oaks, have those vessel elements. And so if you go in a cold, arid region, you'll typically see it dominated by evergreen species, so conifer species. So here you have a spruce on the top left, you have a sequoia on the top right. This is a juniper, and then you have a deciduous gymnosperm down here, which is a tamarack. And so they actually will change leaf color and drop their leaves whenever it becomes colder, or there isn't a high availability of, say, water. And so they'll drop their leaves so they don't have to put resources into maintaining those leafy structures. So another type of gymnosperms. So we said a lot of the gymnosperms are conifers. But then there are some gymnosperm species that fall into other groupings. Another of those groupings is the cyclads. These were present in high abundances, say during the Cretaceous, the Jurassic period, when the dinosaurs were around. They are, near extinction now. There's not many species left. There's only about 100 species left. You generally find them in gardens. They're used as like ornamental, decorative items, and they really resemble palm trees. However, they're not a palm species. And so here's an example of a cyclad. And so you see the cones here, which suggests a gymnosperm, and it has, this palm-like structure, but again, it's not a palm species, and it's not related to a palm species. Um, and again, that grouping or plants from that grouping are heavily affected um, in terms of changes in environmental conditions, and it's affecting their populations, and they're some species are pretty close to extinction. A third grouping of conifer, not conifer, but gymnosperm, are the um, ginkgophytes. And so there's one species that exists that's remaining from the ginkgophyte grouping, and that's the Ginkgo bilboa species. So basically a ginkgo tree. And these ginkgo trees are really resistant to pollution, which is an interesting characteristic to have, especially due to the fact that these trees are often planted as decoration in cities and landscaping areas like that. And generally, landscapers will try to plant male trees. And so for the ginkgo species, you'll have male and female trees. And so the males will produce the pollen, the females will produce the eggs and the seeds. And the reason why they favor male trees is because the female trees give off a really bad smell when they develop their seeds. And if you've ever been around a female ginkgo tree, like it really smells bad. And so that's one reason why you see higher numbers of male trees planted. And you can imagine that that would affect kind of how that species does in terms of its abundance and distribution. But um, like I said, there's only, this species left, and it's mainly this ornamental species. But there are some kind of medicinal purposes for ginkgo. So you may have heard that ginkgo helps like with brain development, memory development, and that sort of thing. And so there's like medications and over-the-counter supplements that you can take that have ginkgo in it. And so that's another purpose that ginkgo can provide. So here's a picture of a ginkgo. Um, and you can see it has this really characteristic kind of fan-shaped leaf. These are the fruits of the ginkgo species, and again, these fruits and seeds are really what smells bad in the female individuals. Now, the last group of gymnosperms are called the cnidophytes. The cnidophytes are the closest relative to angiosperms, and so they share a common ancestor with the angiosperm group. They're more closely related to kind of the vine species that's in the tropics, the tropical areas of the world. And you also can find them in the southwestern portion of the US in the drier, more arid areas. And there's a pretty common cnidophyte species called ephedra that grows out there, and that's where ephedrine comes from, which is a decongestant. And the species that exist out there it also goes by the common name of a Mormon tea. And so basically they would take this plant and you know make a tea out of it um, to help with colds and to serve as a decongestant basically. So you can find this again, this plant in the southwestern United States. All right, so the last group we're going to talk about in our overview of plants are the angiosperms. Now, just like the gymnosperms, the angiosperms are seeded vascular plants, but they have a couple of adaptations that the gymnosperms don't have. And these two adaptations really made angiosperms super successful. And you can see that in just the sheer number of diversity that angiosperms have. Angiosperms have about 260,000 species, and this number is second only to insects in terms of diversity. So angiosperms are the second largest group in terms of species and diversity of all of the organisms that live on the planet. And angiosperms really dominate your terrestrial ecosystems in terms of the vegetation. And when you walk outside and you examine your yard or your property, or you're driving down the street and you look at a plant, 9 times out of 10, you're most likely going to be looking at an angiosperm. Um, and so these are like your flowering plants, your fruiting plants, and those are the two big evolutionary changes that happened in angiosperms that really allowed them to be so successful, and that is the development of flowers and the development of fruits. So flowers really changed the game because they are now able to attract animals to their reproductive parts to help disperse the pollen and to help make sure that their plant is going to reproduce, that their genes are going to be passed on to the next generation. And then you also have the development of these fruits. And the fruits are the structure that protects the embryo, but they're also favored by certain organisms in which the organisms will eat it and then um, defecate somewhere and drop the seeds. And so now you have this instance where seeds are now in a new location and they're in poop, which is a really good fertilizer. And so you have kind of this key setup to where that seed can germinate. And then you also have disposal mechanisms on these seeds where they'll like stick to the fur and be carried away, or lots of other interesting mechanisms that helps out with that dispersal and protection. And so these two adaptations were really important in leading angiosperms to really be able to diversify and radiate into such a large number of species across the globe. And so these are flowers that are growing in a botanical garden. And you can see that angiosperms is pretty much um, the dominant grouping here. You can see some gymnosperms, some conifer species, but pretty much all of these are angiosperms, right, aside from the conifer species. And not only is it the flowers and or I should say, one important part of the flowers is the colorations and the smells is what really leads to pollinators being attracted to those flowers, and then also the resources that those flowers can provide in terms of nectar, which can allow bees to make honey, or allow a hummingbird to get enough energy to beat its wings so fast or so many times in a minute. And so just really interesting, unique structures that really allowed the group to be super successful. And so next we're going to talk about flowers specifically. We're going to talk about the structure of flowers. And you really want to be able to label and identify these structures as well. So if I gave you a flower or a picture of a flower, you would need to be able to label these parts on that flower. Okay. And so flowers have petals and sepals. Okay. um, which are in petals are corolla and sepals are calyx. Okay, and so um, your flower will have your petals and your sepals, and then depending on whether or not it is a female or a male flower, or a combination of both, so they can have both reproductive parts on the same flower. Um, the female will have a carpel and a pistil, which is made up of the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovules. Okay. The male will have the androecium, or the stamens, which is made up of a filament and an anther. Okay. And so the terms I really want you to be familiar with are the petals, the sepals, the pistil, the carpel, and the stamens. Okay. And so we'll look at a figure here to kind of hopefully clarify this. Okay. So your carpel, right, is made up of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And this is a female structure. So your stigma is the top part here. Your style is kind of the connection of the stigma to the ovary. And the ovary is where the ovules are held. And the ovules is what the pollen tube will grow into to fertilize the egg that's inside of that ovule. Now, this flower is a flower that contains both male and female reproductive structures. So the carpel is here in the middle, and then you have the stamen, which is this structure here. And the stamen is made up of the anther, which is kind of the yellow pollen containing structure, and then the filament, which is the green structure that attaches to the base of the flower. Okay. The um, the gosh, I'm blanking. I'm so sorry. The carpel is also known as a gynoecium. Okay, and then the stamen is also known as the androecium. Okay, so I'm not really worried about you knowing those two names. Just as an FYI, I want you to be more familiar with the more common terms, which are carpels and stamens. Okay, so again, carpel, stigma style ovary. The stamen is the anther and the filament. Okay, male reproductive structure, female reproductive structure, and the male gametophyte, or I'm sorry, the male gamete is the microsporangium, which is the pollen shown here. The female is the megasporangium, which is the ovules shown in this figure. And remember, they are heterosporous, which is why we have microsporangium and megasporangium. So different types of gametes, different sizes. Okay, and so those are the main structures of the flower that I want you to be familiar with. I guess I mentioned these in the last slide, but not this slide. But you also have the petals, right, which are these yellow structures, and then the sepals, which are these structures here. Okay, and those two make up what's called the perianth. So the sepals, the petals, and then your reproductive structures on the inside of the flower. Okay. And then just to let you know as well, perfect flowers are flowers that have both reproductive parts, so a male and a female reproductive part. An imperfect flower only has one, so it'd either be a female flower or a male flower. And different species will have different versions of this. So one species may be imperfect, another species will be perfect, etc. And so it's just species dependent on which one is which. Now looking at the fruit, which is the second big evolutionary adaptation for angiosperms. So fruit is kind of this misused term in public, right, out of the scientific field. You know, for the longest time, people have referred to like tomatoes and squash and cucumbers as vegetables, and things like apples and oranges and grapes as fruit. Well, the biology definition basically places many vegetables as fruits because their seeds are derived from thickened ovarian tissue. Okay, and we'll look at what I mean by this in a couple slides. But basically what happens is when the pollination happens, when the fertilization happens, this ovary, this tissue will thicken and develop into the fruit. So any plant that gives off produce, right, gives off a product that comes from that ovarian tissue that has seeds inside of it is a fruit. And so things like berries, peaches, tomatoes, apples, cucumbers, right? They all come from a flower that the ovary inside that flower develops into that structure. So that makes them a fruit. The vegetables are the leafy root parts of the plant. So like celery is a vegetable, right? It doesn't derive from that ovarian tissue. Um, Potatoes are a root. Carrots are a root. Lettuce is the leafy part of the plant. So those are actually vegetables, whereas the tomatoes and the cucumbers are technically fruits based off of this botany definition. Um, and your fruit types are really diverse, as we've just mentioned, different types, different shapes. And then also, depending on the fruit, they'll have different methods of dispersal. Some fruits can be dispersed by wind or water or other animals. Um, the fruits can be fleshy, like the berries, peaches, apples, and tomatoes, or they can be dry, like your nuts, like almonds or wheat or rice. So all of those develop from the ovarian tissue. Um, and so the fruit again is really important for protecting the the embryo, the seeds, um, until they can be dispersed and germinated. All right. So let's look at a typical life cycle of an angiosperm. So for your male gametes, you're going to have a pollen grain. They're haploid. They also have two cells, like your gymnosperms. One becomes two sperm cells, and the second becomes the pollen tube. So exactly the same in gymnosperms. The female will have three regions in the embryo sac. She'll have the egg, two cells on one end, and three cells on the other end. Okay. Then there are also two fused nuclei in the middle, and we'll get at this in more detail here in a second. But there is this process of double fertilization that happens in angiosperms, and it's unique to the angiosperm group. And we'll kind of show how that happens in the next slide. So just kind of put these, in the back of your mind, three regions in the female embryo. Male has those two sperm cells and the pollen tube, right, that comes from the second cell. And we're going to show where these are here, okay? So here we have a typical life cycle of an angiosperm. You have your flower, right, with your male structure, right? And then you have your female structure, okay? So the male structure has the anther where the pollen is located. So the stamen has the anther with the pollen. That pollen will develop into what's called a tetrad. And so notice there are kind of four cells in here. And it does that in meiosis. Okay. And then one of your tetrads will, after mitosis, will develop into your two-celled mature pollen grain. Okay. That pollen grain will land on the stigma of the female reproductive structure. One of those cells will grow into a pollen tube that will grow down and merge with an ovary. Okay. Then the two sperm cells will go down that pollen tube into the ovary. Okay. Now, here we have that female structure. Okay, and so let's go back just for a second. With that female structure, remember we said we had three regions. Okay, we have an egg plus two cells on one end, and we have three cells on the other end, and then two fused nuclei in the middle. All right, so let's locate those. So you have an egg with two cells on one end, so this is the end here. You have your three cells on the other end, and then you have your two cells in the middle. Okay, so what happens is with angiosperms, one of those sperm cells will fertilize the egg. another sperm cell will fertilize the two egg or will join with the two eggs in the middle. And remember, we said that these two fused nuclei were diploid. So this is an event where you have two fertilization happening at the same time, basically. So this is double fertilization. And once that double fertilization happens, the egg will develop into the embryo, right, like we show here. And then this sperm fusing or fertilizing those two fused eggs will develop into the endosperm, which is all of this gray area on the inside here. Then you have a seed coat on the outside. And then once that germinates, the embryo will grow into a new adult individual. And so that double fertilization process leads to the embryo and the endosperm. Okay, so we have a more detailed figure here. And so, well, not on this slide, but on the next slide, we'll have that more detailed figure. And so basically, double fertilization is one sperm will fertilize with the egg to make a diploid zygote, which is your embryo, right? This will grow cotyledons and transmit food to the embryo, okay? One sperm will unite with the diploid cells in the middle. And so since those cells in the middle are diploid, then that means that the addition of the sperm cell to those two diploid cells adds another copy of the chromosomes. So they then become triploid. And so the endosperm that results from that process is a triploid cell. And this is the food reserve. Okay. And I should note, I said this like the embryo will grow to cotyledons, but that's not the case. So this is just basically saying that cotyledons will grow to help transmit food to the embryo. And then you have a tough seed coat to develop on the outside. Okay, so let's look at this figure in more detail. Let's look at this process in more detail. So you have your pollen tube that grows down into the ovary. Okay, then you have one nuclei to go down the pollen tube and fertilize the egg. Then you have another to fertilize the two fused nuclei. This event will lead to your endosperm, which is the purple shown inside the seed. And then this fertilization event will lead to the embryo. And then the embryo will use that endosperm as nutrients to grow and develop. And then when it's ready and the environmental conditions are right, the seed will germinate and grow into a new adult angiosperm. And so again, this double fertilization only occurs in angiosperms, only occurs in this group of plants. All right, so we mentioned imperfect and perfect flowers previously, and now we're just going to go into a little more detail about those. So you can have, like we already talked about, two types of flowers. You can have perfect or you can have imperfect. Okay. So perfect is having both male and female parts on one flower. Imperfect is having a flower that has only male parts and a flower that only has female parts. And usually your flowers are on different plants. So you'll have like a male plant and a female plant, like we mentioned with the ginkgo. Okay? And so your monoecious is basically one house. I mean, it's what it means, one house. So it's having both male and female structures. And botanists will often refer to these as hermaphrodites because they do have both structures on the same flower. And typically cross-pollination doesn't, it's rare, but it can happen, and you can get cross-pollination to happen. With dioecious, meaning two houses, basically because you have one plant for males or one house, and then one plant for females or one house, right? So one flower for each of those. And cross pollination is frequent because you have those separate plants that hold those separate flower types. So here you see a perfect flower, monoecious flower. You have your stamen, right? And then you have your stigma, your style, and your ovary, right? So the carpels. Here you have a dioecious, so a male flower and a female flower. And same thing here. You have your male and your female. Actually, for this one here, I think it's just hard to see. I think this is a monoecious plant as well. Not really sure. But it looks like, looking at it now, they may be both. I'm not 100% sure about this one here. But this one is definitely monoecious, both on the same flower, and then these two have your separate plants for each reproductive type. Now, looking at the evolution of angiosperms, right? So we talked about how the adaptation of seeds and fruits really allowed angiosperms to diversify and take over terrestrial environments, because it really allowed them to to get away from the need of water, excuse me, and to also serve as a way to make sure their plants are pollinated and to make sure they have appropriate dispersal mechanisms. Now, basal angiosperms actually branched off before we have this separation of angiosperms into monocots and dicots. So angiosperms, modern angiosperms, are grouped in two groups basically. And those are referred to as monocots or dicots, or you'll also see it sometimes as eudicots or true dicots. Now, the ancestors to these two groupings had traits that we see in monocots and dicots. So they shared traits from both of those groups. Okay. And an example of this is a magnolia tree, or the groups that the magnolia, laurels, etc. So basically, these plants here have characteristics from both monocot groups and dicot groups. Okay. And you're probably saying, well, I don't know what those characteristics are. Well, if we look here, the characteristics of monocots and dicots are that monocots have one cotyledon as a seedling, and dicots have two. So basically what a cotyledon is, so whenever a plant grows up and germinates right out of the soil, it will have a little seed leaf, right? Those seed leaves are the cotyledons. It will either have two seed leaves, like shown here, or it could typically have, like, a grass, which is just like one seed leaf, right? Which is a monocot. The veins in the leaves can either be parallel or branched. If they're parallel, they're a monocot, and if they're branched, they're a dicot. So parallel is, think of a blade of grass. When you pick up a blade of grass, those veins are all running parallel to each other. They're running vertically with the structure of the plant. Now, vascular tissue is the xylem and the phloem, and basically is it scattered or as a ring pattern. So if we cut a plant stem in half, we did a cross section, if the vascular tissue is scattered, right, so kind of like this, then it's a monocot. If the vascular tissue is in a ring pattern like that, then it is a dicot. Okay. Monocots also have root have a network of roots, which are kind of like your, really branched out roots, right, like that. Whereas dicots have a fairly big taproot, right? And they may have like some fibrous roots that are growing off of that, but it's not this vast network like you see with monocots. Okay? Now with monocots, the numbers of petals and the numbers of reproductive parts are either 3 or a multiple of 3, right? So for example, if you have stamen on a flower, it will be in numbers of 3, 6, 9, etc. And that's a monocot. A dicot would have 4, 5, or multiples of 4 and 5. So 8, 10, 12, 15, etc. Right? And dicots actually make up a large proportion of angiosperms. So about 2/3, so roughly 66% of all angiosperms are from the dicot group. Some examples of dicots are like dandelions, daisies, beans, those type of species. Examples of monocots are like palms, orchids, true lilies, corn, grasses, etc. So those would be your examples of monocots. Some species, though, may have traits of both. So it determining whether they're a monocot or dicot can be difficult in that situation. So like the magnolia, right, and the lotus are plants that have features from both monocots and dicots. Okay? And so that can make them a little difficult to tell apart. And so here are some examples of monocots and dicots. So you have rice, which is a monocot, other cereal grains. Beans are dicots. This lily is a monocot, and this daisy is a dicot. Okay, and so those are just some examples. And so you'll want to know this little comparison summary, right? So you'll want to know that monocots are one cotyledon, they have parallel veins, they have scattered vascular tissue, they have network of roots, petals are in 3s, and maybe like an example or so. Same thing with dicots. You'll want to know those typical characteristics of that group. Okay, and so that's it for our overview of plants. We've looked at the evolution of plants, we've looked at the key characteristics of plants, where they came from, and then we looked at the 4 major plant groups that exist today, and kind of did just a brief overview of their important structures and characteristics. And so that's it for Module 13. As always, let me know if you have any questions or any concerns, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or week, and we will see you in the next module.